Well, I think you do both. As the investment committee, you look at whether the staff has implemented and added value or lost value. You also look at it from the perspective has the fund met its long-term objectives? You do both.
But we're using a single benchmark for both.
Yes.
And that's sort of the introduction from Stephen is that's potentially a problem. So I'm just hoping at some point we'll spend some time on that, because I think that's a real problem.
Right. The biggest issue there, and I don't want to take too much, but that's timing. And the reality is when you have a very long dated security in the short term or shorter term measurement period, it creates a lot of noise, but we're not going to be able to address that.
I think it's more to it than that, but that's what I hope when we talk about benchmarking and investments, that we can spend some more time on that.
And Paul, I want to, before Chris answers, I think that, well, first of all, I want to say that what we do, Stephen's point is that that we deal with would it be alpha above the benchmark? That would be the incentive part of it. And so, and I think so we're trying to incentivize staff to earn more or to gain more than just what their benchmark is. And so I think so I want to be really careful that I think the committee has really taken to heart that what we're trying to do is incentivize staff. So these are incentives, not just bonuses. So if we can kind of have common terminology, I think that'd be really helpful. We want to incentivize staff, so they're incentives. I want to remind, and I think I think those of us who are on the compensation committee are fairly aware of this. We felt that having a conversation about the incentive program was really important, and we started that over a year ago. And we started that education with Luis at an offsite in San Diego. And for whatever reason, the beginning of that education process went sideways and we shut it down. So we had an opportunity to talk about differentiating and talking about long-term incentives, short-term incentives. And we kind of put that, and maybe we were trying to put the cart before the horse as we were moving towards a more collaborative model within investments. But we had the opportunity to do that. And I think that's something that if we really want to get into that, then we need to, and Melissa and I have had this conversation, and we kind of hit upon it at our offsite this last time, about maybe starting that education process again. That maybe we do have different benchmarks for compensation and incentives that are different. But I think to start having that conversation, start thinking about it, we need to go back to the education program that we started, that we kind of put off on the back burner. All right, Chris, go ahead and respond.
Real quick, you guys know the adage, what gets measured gets managed. So, Paul, to clarify, the investment committee adopts benchmarks to measure the asset class and to measure what they're trying to do. There's no doubt in everybody's mind, it's also, when we're measuring that, we want our staff to then achieve that. So there's always a bit of a link, but the investment committee adopts a benchmark to measure what they want to invest in. You then, as the compensation committee, approve that in your attachments. And right now, there's a very tight alignment of what you want to achieve and then what you're motivating staff. But I would always encourage you to keep in mind, as the comp committee, you're trying to manage it from a human resource perspective. What are you trying to motivate people to do? I like the tight alignment between the two so that we're compensated to achieve exactly what you're measuring to the public. And that's a future discussion for you, is how do you achieve that? But it's back to the measuring is hard back to my example, measuring's hard in bridges because you just don't have an index you can get out of the paper. But in the other areas, it's easier.
All right, thank you. Stephen, any more?
Thanks. Moving on to the final few slides here. A few examples from other institutions that have performance incentive programs, and as you're all aware, most public plans do not, because many public plans don't have delegated authority. And some that have delegated authority don't have incentive comp in the way that you do it. So it's a relatively small universe. Luis spoke earlier about sort of the governance processes. We have here just a extraction of the governance process with CalPERS across the river. The important point here to kind of draw alignment between this process and yours is sort of at all levels, the board investment consultant is representing the board in approving investment performance compensation for staff. So that's something to note that's common across various institutions. The slide on page 24 just highlights three organizations that also have incentive compensation. As Luis indicated earlier, programs have more similarities than the differences. And a variety of questions that are worth sort of asking yourselves, both from the comp committee perspective, but more broadly as well, is what's the appropriate time horizon when judging performance against a benchmark? To Paul's earlier questions on private market asset classes, before even having a discussion on what the appropriate benchmark is, I would step back a second and highlight that if you're measuring and rewarding people or not based on 3 years performance in real estate and private equity and infrastructure, you're rewarding them or not based much more on factors they have zero control over than factors they have control over. So we shouldn't fool ourselves to think that the perfect benchmark is going to somehow align behavior and align expectations. In those asset classes, unfortunately, the reality is you can't measure skill or not over a period as short as 3 years. So that's in a sense the original sin of incentive comp within those asset classes. As we've talked about, how should private asset classes where indexing and not an option be benchmarked? It's a big issue from an investment standpoint. It's also a big issue from a compensation benchmark standpoint. How should investment constraints be handled? There's a number of reasons why your portfolio will not reflect the market opportunity set over time. Partly structural reasons related to size of your portfolio. You may not be able to get exposure to all parts of the market in the proportions that you would otherwise want to get exposure to. And it's not a staff execution issue. It's a constraint you have because of your size. You have policies, ESG policies, risk factors, divestment policies that cause your portfolio to look different than the universe of stocks. And so, while like Alan, I would agree that the benchmarks should represent the broadest opportunity set available. We should all recognize that the broadest opportunity set available may not be the broad market for you. How should board decisions be reflected in the benchmarks is a question that should be addressed. How should the board handle the trade-off between simplicity and complexity in benchmarks? As we've seen in private equity in particular, you can get as granular and complex as you want to get to try to measure certain things in different asset classes. And sometimes there's value in doing that, but there's also the downside of benchmarks becoming increasingly complex, customized, and harder to explain to the outside world. Should discretion ever be used in finalizing benchmarks for incentive payouts? And the governance review process around benchmark updates related to senior staff members and board consultants. So all these are relevant questions I just highlight as we kind of finalize the presentation. And there's three items I just want to from a compensation committee perspective, I want to highlight related to the private market benchmark issue. As I mentioned, number one, the 3-year time horizon of your incentive compensation plan is going to make any benchmark in the private markets more or less irrelevant. I mean, you're not measuring anything there. Secondly, which is more nuanced and not as important, is even if you extend the time frame, the right way to measure performance in the private markets is internal rates of return, actual dollar-for-dollar returns, not time-weighted rates of return. Your incentive compensation and composite benchmark process right now uses time-weighted rates of return so that the private market indexes can tie into your total fund benchmark. But that is also another complexity that makes the private markets challenging to benchmark. And then as a final note to Paul's point, which I agree with, that there should be an acknowledgement that within policy parameters, staff's decisions to underweight or overweight asset classes should be accounted for. I just wanted to highlight, Paul, I agree with that, but I think to some extent that's already addressed because the underweighting and overweighting rolls up into the total fund return and the total fund benchmark. So I don't think it's addressed fully, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there is, if staff is underweight a benchmark and that benchmark, an asset class, and that asset class does really well, that's gonna be reflected in the total fund return. So to some extent that's addressed, but there are other areas where it's not fully addressed, which I would acknowledge.
Thank you, Stephen. Any further comments? This is our last slide. Is there any further comments from our panelists? Paul?
Well, thank you. This has been really helpful and I think a really good beginning to a conversation. I'll just say that, you know, I spent close to 2 decades making incentive compensation decisions in the company that I was a partner in, and they were always qualitative. We had all sorts of quantitative measures, but at the end of the day, they were all qualitative, and they were qualitative because we wanted to give incentives to people we wanted to have stick around more than the people who we didn't want to have stick around. We made compensation decisions knowing that somebody was making an investment in something we thought was going to pay off, and if we based it on dollars today, that person wouldn't be compensated. So, you know, I'm completely of the opinion, especially when you try to build and maintain a team, as Chris has done so well, that you cannot do that with an incentive system that doesn't have a strong qualitative element to it. At the extreme, I think what we should consider, I'm not sure we can get away with this, is that we should consider a benchmark for the fund, and based on the benchmark performance for the fund, that becomes an incentive compensation pool for Chris to distribute. And for us not to get involved in anything other than making a decision about what his incentive compensation is. And then we just give him a pot of money, and he's the guy we've entrusted to manage the team, and we let him distribute it. I mean, I would like to have that conversation. That ties the compensation actually to a benchmark, because we say the incentive compensation pool is how well did the fund do relative to the benchmark in aggregate. And then the board steps back and we say we don't have anything more to do with it. So I'd love, and then benchmarks by asset class can be specific to measuring the performance of the fund. So just throw that out there for better or for worse as we go forward, but I really appreciate having this conversation and look forward to the conversation in investments as well. Thank you.
Harry?
In principle, I agree with what Paul just stated. I think it's a big step from where we are. And I, speaking for myself, would be open to understanding what that actually would look like and whether or not there's support. I think it would simplify, from my perspective, our plan. I don't think this is, we're obviously not going to make that decision today. It's a big step from where we are currently and what we've built here. Philosophically, on its surface, I personally would like to understand it more. I'd like to hear from our, not at this time, at the appropriate time agendized, to look at it, and I would even take it a step further. Yeah, I would like to see us broaden the pool of people that are receiving incentive pay at CalSTRS. And I don't know what the limitations are or aren't around that. I'm sure there are some. But I like the concept of, there's a benchmark, there's a team, we believe in a team approach. It's managed by the Chief Executive Investment Officer. He or she decides, or who he delegates, and how it's divvied up amongst the players on that team within the organization. So I'm not going to belabor the point. There's a lot of research that would have to go into this and conversation. But on its surface, I would like to explore it and understand more what that would look like. In the past, and staff has provided to us, I've asked for the amount of dollars that we've paid out in incentive pay over a 10-year period, so we know what type of, how large that pool could be. And I would actually advocate for a position where who would be eligible for pay in the incentive pay in the organization would also grow.
Ready? Jacqueline?
I really appreciate everyone's presentation. It's given us a lot to think about, and me a lot to think about. This is all relatively new to me. I'm also interested in what Paul and Harry had to say, and I'd like to, at the appropriate time, continue this conversation and really kind of prioritize continuing this conversation. I think it's very a compelling shift philosophically, and I think we should spend some time on this in the future, whenever that's appropriate, Dana.
Alrighty. So that was going to be my ask. And so I think it's pretty clear, Melissa, that we want to return back to having some education and having some discussion on the incentive program. Let me ask the committee, do we want to do this in conjunction with the benchmarking? Well, I think the education piece we get in investments on the benchmarking will help inform our conversations. But part of the reason why we set this off again was because we were looking at the collaborative model. Do we want to wait until that's finished? Or do we want to start our education prior to that so we're ready to go once that model's done?
I was just asking when we're doing the benchmarking education piece for the investment committee, and he said
The earliest would be,
like
the earliest would be
May.
this spring.
Right.
And also, we're going to be doing the labor market analysis in May. So,
Right.
as you recall, the last time we embarked on the that comprehensive incentive plan evaluation, it was on the heels of that, the results from that. So
Right.
that should help generate.
So is the
Discussion.
consensus of the board then that we will begin that once we have our labor? We'll try to do it as soon as we can after the labor analysis.
Yeah, maybe June, but maybe
It might
in the
end up
new
being on next year's work plan.
1920 work plan.
Alrighty?
Okay.
And then that way, we're not too far ahead or behind the collaborative model coming out of investments. All right, any other questions on this item? Gentlemen, great tee off for us to get back into it. We appreciate it. Thanks very much for your presentation. All right, Melissa? We just cut your presentation down, you know. All righty, we're moving on to action item number 6, the evaluation of the delegation authority. Melissa, I'll turn that back over to you.
Okay, so this item is reviewing the CEO delegation related to compensation administration matters. If you recall, last time the CEO delegation was reviewed was in the spring and summer of 2016. And at that time, the committee did make some updates to the delegation. In your materials, attachment 1 is a chart that highlights some of the updates that were made at that time. It's highlighted in pink there. So I won't go through it, but I just want to make sure that I call your attention to those updates you made. What I do want to focus in on is the proposal that staff is recommending the committee consider. This is really based on the feedback that has been provided at investment as well as the compensation committees relative to the oversight that the CEO and the CIO have for staff's incentive. So staff is proposing that the committee consider moving delegation to the CEO for setting the quantitative and qualitative performance component weightings for the positions, for all the positions except for the CEO. And so it's not the incentive opportunity range, it's really the weightings within that incentive opportunity that we're speaking of here. The other item that staff is recommending the committee consider is moving the performance award scales and benchmarks for asset class levels to the CEO to update. So we just spoke about that during this education session. We know that in the compensation world, we adopt those benchmark changes from the investment committee. So this is really just delegating to the CEO the ability to update the appendices that are in the procedures for the compensation incentive plan to the CEO. And so those are really the only two that I'll be recommending. Past committee sessions and feedback that we've received from board members is the desire to still keep the compensation philosophy and the compensation incentive plan structure really at the board level. This recommendation, hopefully in your minds, supports though the efficiency of supporting the board in that overview with delegating to the CEO those administrative components. So at this time, I'll pass it back to you, Dana, if there's any questions or feedback on the recommendations.
I just have one really quickly, on our market pay analysis review.
Yes.
Even though we're moving the delegation to initiate that analysis, it still would be conducted every 2 years, correct?
Correct.
Alrighty,
It's just the initiation
just
of it.
getting it started. Alrighty, Sharon,
I would move staff recommendation.
is there a second?
Oh.
Could I get a
Jump in.
second?
Nobody
We got,
jumped in.
okay, it's been seconded. That's okay, thanks, guys. All right, so now we have a motion on the floor. We can further discuss it. Sharon, did you want to speak to that at all?
No.
Paul?
So I'm sorry, I was just a little confused on comp 17. It says delegate to the CEO decisions for setting or adjusting performance weightings and settings or adjusting performance award scales and benchmarks for asset class levels. So maybe I'm just missing something here. So we're delegating to the CEO
Correct.
the compensation decisions for investments.
Correct. Yes.
And is that a change?
So the recommendation would be a change. Right now, the CEO has delegation for some of the components within the incentive plan structure. The CEO has complete authority to approve incentive pay for the, except for the CIO.
I approve
Those
the,
in-
I approve the delegated incentive pay for the investment staff in consultation with Chris.
Okay,
In
so.
fact, we might even add that word to that.
In consultation with the CIO?
Yeah,
That's
it's really
probably helpful.
delegation to the CEO in consultation with the CIO.
That works?
Decision.
That would help me understand what we're doing.
We can
here.
definitely distinguish that.
Right,
Yeah. okay.
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I understand what you're saying.
Brian?
So I need to go back, who seconded the motion?
Harry?
It's not on for me.
If we make that change, I'll second it.
You know, listen,
We thought Harry was on the committee.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
My principal assistant checked, so if we're wrong, I apologize.
You want to be on the committee?
Shoot, maybe we can-
No, we'll let Paul second in the motion.
Yeah.
I do recall, it was at the beginning of the fiscal year that that was brought up.
He
and-
did ask to be included on compensation.
And then I apologize.
That's okay. We'll just make sure we get him on it now.
We have it on tape.
Yeah, that's how he got away with asking the question.
Yeah.
All righty.
Madam Chair, check.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Brian, you got to keep us on our toes. We appreciate that.
You have to keep me on my toes.
There you go. There you go. All righty. Paul, does that help? And I think I
Yeah,
have
that
consensus
helps.
of the committee for
That
that.
helps. Yeah, thank you.
That's current practice. All righty. Jacqueline?
I just had a question about the bullet that was in the discussion on Comp 17 about establishing a periodic reporting feature
Yes.
to the committee. Is that something, when would that, does that need to be part of a motion, or is that something that would be flushed out? Can you tell me kind of, have we,
What I can do is bring an update when we have a compensation committee to update all of you on those updates that were made through the delegation of the CEO. For example, when there is weightings that are being adopted, I can come back and provide an update of what those are to the committee, if you'd like. I can do
Okay.
it annually, I could do it.
yeah, well, I don't know what's most appropriate, if it's annually or all changes are a certain threshold. I just kind of wanted to understand better what was being considered.
Personally, I think, and I don't want to speak for the whole committee, but I would think that we should at least start out that whenever there is a change, that we do it then. If we start to feel comfortable that it's not happening frequently, maybe it could be annually. What I would hate would be for something to change and 10 months go down the road and then the committee's informed of it and we're surprised.
I think that's right. I just wanted to make sure that that was part of this. I'm fine with the delegation.
Yeah.
I just didn't
Right.
want that to get lost. It was sort of part of the board materials that seemed like it
Right.
made sense to
We
me at the
appreciate
time.
that, Jacqueline. All righty. Any further comments on that? Are you okay with that?
Yep.
Doing it that way? Harry,
Oh, no,
you're good?
yep,
Okay.
thanks.
All righty. So we have a motion to approve staff's recommendation with the inclusion of, in consultation with the CIO on the pertinent item, within the item. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All right, we've approved that recommendation. You didn't even need the whole half hour. Look at that.
Don't comment on the
Yeah, I
timing
probably
thing.
should not, that doesn't do me really well, because,
Not
yes.
Micah.
Alrighty, going back to our agenda. I don't think we have any information requests other than what we will put on our possible work plan, and we'll track that. Saeed, did you have anything else? Alrighty. We have the draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Melissa, you want to go over that with us, please?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're going to be bringing in May the labor market study that McLaughlin will be assisting with. And then technical housekeeping, really, that is the RMS check on benchmarks that the committee has asked to get annual updates on. So that's really speaking to that. Dana, what I would like to get your and the committee's feedback on is during discussions in other meetings, there was brought up a CEO, CIO paid during transitional years as an education session. And, May's meeting is pretty heavy, so we don't have a compensation committee scheduled in March. However, I think you probably want to separate that education session out, and March seems like an ideal time to hold it. But I put it back to you as far as when you think it's appropriate to have that session for.
As all the members of the committee know, that we've been taking a good look at succession levels, and this would fit right into that. Jack, we were talking yesterday about our next meeting having a light agenda. Would it be more appropriate to add a committee meeting then, or do you think we're good in March?
There's certainly time in January, but I don't know what it takes to get organized around that and everything. I don't, it didn't seem a rush, so I think if March feels good to you in terms of planning it, I think that's fine. Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
I think we're good with that.
Go ahead and add that.
Yeah, Sharon?
Yeah, I don't know if this fell under information request, but just making sure that the comments around looking at incentive under the CIO item, that happens in the next year's agenda? That the issue that Paul is bringing up about looking at.
Yeah, I think that'll be.
I just wanted to make sure that doesn't get lost, that when we plan for next
That'll
year's
be added to the
comp.
work.
Right, no, yeah, the idea that we would have a
gonna
pool and the CIO,
refresh that
I think that's
conversation.
all gonna be part of our education
Perfect.
thing on the incentive program.
Awesome.
Alrighty. Saeed, if you could make sure that that idea definitely gets captured in that, I know Melissa has it.
Yep.
So we have it somewhere, we'll be reminded of that. Alrighty, anything else good for the committee? Are there any statements from the public? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Mr. Chair?
10:15.
10:15, alrighty. Investments will start at 10:15.
Closed session.
Closed session, correct?
Closed
So
session,
plan
yeah.
Closed
advisory
session,
committee.
alrighty. Thank you.
Advisory.